Ruth was walking in the Canadian wilderness when a chance encounter led to an incredible story she will never forget. Being in the great outdoors amongst nature with the sunshine dancing on her face was the most magical feeling. She and her husband owned a remote dairy farm in British Columbia. It was surrounded by miles and miles of forests, lakes, and rivers. Working the dairy farm was a never-ending cycle of work, bringing the cows in for milking twice every day, every single day of the week, once in the early morning and once in the late afternoon. There was no let-up, but Ruth always found time to escape and enjoy the surrounding wilderness. In the mid-morning, after the cows had been milked and the parlor had been washed down, Ruth would head off with the dogs for an hour's walk whilst her husband Jeremy would feed the cows, scrape out their housing, and lay down fresh bedding or release them onto pasture, depending on the time of year. One December morning when Ruth and Jeremy stepped outside, in the beam of their flashlight, they could see that their farm was blanketed in a thick layer of snow. It shimmered in the torchlight, a pristine white, and the two of them wrapped up warm to go and milk the cows. When they were finished and they walked out of the barn, the sun was just rising over the horizon, and the landscape was transformed from darkness to a scene of pure beauty. The remarkable scenery was something that had attracted the couple to the remote location in the first place. As Ruth set off on her walk, the snow crunched under her feet, and her two dogs bounded past her, rushing through the white stuff with excitement. They rolled onto their backs, kicking at the snow. Then the path opened out from the woodland beside the lake, and they followed it along the water's edge for some distance. The lake was partially frozen over, and on top of the ice sat a foot of snow. After 20 minutes, the dogs had disappeared ahead of Ruth. This was usual. They were so full of energy that they bounded off into the distance on every walk. But shortly afterward, Ruth could hear them barking at something. Ruth's initial thought was that they may have come across a bear. That was certainly a possibility there in British Columbia. It wasn't uncommon to hear about dogs running into bears and coming away worse for wear. So gingerly, Ruth hurriedly along the path to see what they had found around the corner. After a few hundred yards, that's when she saw them. They were both looking out at the lake, barking incessantly, their tails wagging. At first, Ruth couldn't see what they were fussing about. The sun was shining directly in her eyes, and the glare reflected off the snow, stopping Ruth from seeing very well. She shielded her eyes. There was something in the lake. It was sandy brown in color and splashing in the icy water. Ruth rushed over. When she got closer, she could see that it was a white-tailed deer that had fallen through the ice. Instinctively, Ruth began to step onto the ice, but she stopped herself and stood back. The deer was only a few yards out, but Ruth didn't want to risk falling in herself. She could see the hoof prints through the snow, the trail onto the lake, and now the deer was fighting to keep afloat. It was a desperate scene as the deer flailed about in the freezing cold water. Ruth looked around for something to help, but there wasn't anything. She contemplated getting a branch from the forest, but there was no way she would be able to pull the deer to safety with that, and the deer had no way of holding on. Instead, she pulled her mobile phone from her jacket pocket. The dogs were whining with excitement and pacing up and down the lakeside as Ruth dialed Jeremy's number. The mobile phone signal was patchy, but there was enough to get through. Ruth hurriedly told Jeremy what had happened and asked for him to come and help. Jeremy grabbed a rope and jumped onto his quad bike. After a few minutes, Ruth could hear the distant revving of an engine. Jeremy raced through the woods, emerging a few minutes later beside the river. He then followed the path until he came to Ruth and the dogs. By now, the deer's desperate struggles were getting slower. Ruth could see the animal's eyes bulging with fear, its dark black eyes. It kicked with its front legs, trying to get a purchase on the layer of ice in front of it, but it kept slipping and the ice kept breaking away. It was heartbreaking to watch. Jeremy made a loop at the end of his rope. He then swung it back and forth several times before hurling it towards the deer. He missed. He tried again and again, but it had to be a bullseye to secure around the deer's neck. Ruth held her head in her hands. She was convinced she was going to watch the deer perish right in front of her eyes. She even tentatively stepped onto the ice herself, but as soon as she heard an ominous crack, she leapt back onto dry land. Just as the deer looked like it was giving up, Jeremy landed the rope around its head. He gently pulled, tightened the noose. He then tied the other end to the back of the quad bike and very slowly and carefully pulled the deer from the lake. It was utterly exhausted, and rather than leaping to its feet when it made dry land, it lay on its side, panting, staring at Ruth and Jeremy with its wide, dark eyes. Ruth took off her jacket and lay it on top of the deer while she carefully took the rope off from around its neck. She didn't know if it was too late, if the deer was too exhausted to recover from the ordeal. For a few minutes, the deer just lay there on the frozen ground. It had a white ring of fur around its black nose and white eye patches. Ruth noticed an unusual heart-shaped white patch under its chin, stretching down towards its chest. It was a very beautiful-looking deer, and Ruth placed a hand on the side of its neck and stroked it calmly, trying to reassure it and calm it down. Then the deer lifted its head, pricked its ears, and jumped to its feet. Jeremy had to hold the dogs back, who were eager to run after it, and they all watched as the deer ran off into the woodland, its white tail bobbing up and down behind it. Ruth breathed a sigh of relief. It looked as though the deer was going to be okay after all. She and Jeremy clambered back onto the quad bike and motored back to the farm with the two dogs running alongside them. It had been an eventful day, though one which had thankfully ended happily. Ruth often thought of the white-tailed deer. She knew if she had been half an hour later on her walk, then the deer would have likely drowned, and she would have instead come across it, floating in the frozen lake. But the deer made a surprise appearance 5 years later. Ruth was clearing out one of the barns one spring afternoon when she looked out over the fields. There in the middle of one of them was a deer. It was a brilliant rusty brown color. Its head was turned directly to look at Ruth. As Ruth stopped sweeping and took a few steps outside, she noticed a small fawn step out from behind the deer. It was a beautiful sight. Though she had seen many deer on their farm before, she never grew tired of seeing these wild animals out in nature as they should be. Then she saw something that made her gasp. The doe had a heart-shaped white patch under its chin, stretching down towards its chest. It was the deer that they had saved 5 years earlier. Ruth called for Jeremy, and they both stood staring at the animal. Her coat was glistening in the spring sunshine. The little fawn's enormous ears twitched. Its tail wagged as it ducked underneath its mother for a drink. Ruth and Jeremy could see the white spots along the fawn's flanks. It was beautiful. Through their heroic actions 5 years earlier, not only had a life been saved, but a new life had been created. Ruth felt her eyes fill with tears as they watched in silence as the deer began to walk away from them and up over the brow of the hill. It had been a magical sight and an experience that neither of them would ever forget.